thank you for joining us for this presentation titled For an Equitable Textbook, Universal Design for Learning is a Must, presented by Laura Frost and Sean Nordell. Laura Frost is Professor of Chemistry and Associate Dean at Florida Gulf Coast University. She's co-author of an introductory chemistry textbook in its fourth edition. She has a strong background in K-20 STEM education, focusing on STEM pedagogy that includes the science of learning for effective and inclusive classroom instruction. She currently serves on the TAA Council and chairs the TAA Committee on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Sean Nordell is the Associate Director of Graduate Career Services at the University of Arizona. Her textbook on animal behavior is currently in its third edition and is the first, and the first edition was awarded TAA Most Promising New Textbook. She has an extensive background in pedagogy, working in teaching centers at Brown University and Washington University in St. Louis. She's currently a member of the TAA Committee on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So, hello, Laura and Sean.
Hi. Thank you to everybody who's here. I see a lot of people's names that I recognize, so I feel like almost like I'm at a TAA session, but I can't wait to be back in person next year. Just a little bit of introduction. Thank you, Kevin, for the introduction that you gave us. So at the last, I guess it was 2 years ago, Sean and I did a session for the virtual conference, and we kind of focused on equitable language and inclusive language and things that we could do to our textbooks to be more inclusive. And so I said to Sean, oh, let's do something else for the next virtual conference. And we came up with this idea of taking something from our faculty professional development experience that we both have come into professionally and think about how we can apply that outside of the classroom and into our textbook world. So we didn't come up with Universal Design for Learning, which is called UDL for short. So we're just merely disseminating the information to our members here at the conference, to you. And so we're just kind of doing something different with it. We're trying to apply the ideas behind it to how we write in our textbooks. And so with that, we're going to start off with the next slide.
Yeah, greetings, everyone. And we're excited to have you all here. Thank you so much for coming. We just wanted to start with a little check-in. And we know virtual conferences can be challenging. Everyone loves a good Zoom meeting. We know at this point. So we're just going to ask you a few questions. Yeah, Peggy's already laughing. And you can write these down just for yourself right now. So one, we're just going to ask everybody to think just sort of how present are you for this experience right now? Just to sort of be thinking about where you are and in this space. And then where do you locate your skill set in terms of textbook design for equity and accessibility? And for all these, we're going to ask you to use a 1 to 10 scale. 10 is very high, and just you can write these down for yourself. And then thirdly, how comfortable are you in talking with your publisher about textbook design? And again, using that same 1 through 10 scale. And we're going to ask you just write those down. And if you have any notes about those, write those down. And we're going to talk about those in a little while later. But just to get you start thinking about this topic that we're going to talk about today. Today, what we're really is Laura's already talked about some of the things we've done in previous sessions. And so one of the things we really wanted to talk about is something that we haven't talked about, which is really the design and formatting of textbooks, both print and ebooks, that can create accessible pedagogy and learning, review the principles of universal design, and then talk about some strategies to apply universal design to our own textbooks. And we're curious, how many of you have heard about universal design for learning? And if you'll just put in the chat either yes or no. And then in the chain chat, if you'll put down, if you put down yes, you might put down, I'm using it in my teaching, I'm using it in my textbook or my writing, or some way, or no, I have no clue, or you can just write no. So we'll ask you to put that in the chat, and we're seeing lots of things coming up in the chat. Lots of yeses, yes and both, very exciting. Some no's, using teaching. Yay, Stephanie, Stephanie's both writing and editing of textbooks. Kevin, yes, to using in life. No. Peggy, Director of Disability Services. Yes, so you know where this comes from originally, have heard of it. Yes, coursework curriculum. So this is exciting. So it appears, we've got a diverse audience and we're excited about that. So really what we're talking about is creating learning materials that should be usable by all people without the need for adaptation. And our goal is to create learning materials that are accessible to everyone, inclusive, represent diversity and equity. And that's one of the things that Laura and I have talked about at previous conferences, and also help students develop mastery. Universal design was first introduced in the concept of design of things like buildings and products or environments, to make them accessible to everyone. This comes from Ron Mace and his colleagues at North Carolina State University. They really pioneered the universal design movement in architecture and planning in the 80s. Mace had contracted polio as a child, and when he was at the School of Design, he encountered a lot of barriers moving about the school. And so he became an activist for building environments for making facilities more accessible. And then more recently, this idea of removal of barriers concept has been applied to the field of education, resulting in the Universal Design for Learning framework. And that's where basically the two co-founders here are Ann Meyer and David Rose. Ann is a clinical psychologist and David's a neuropsychologist who've really been at the forefront of this and have founded this organization called CAS that Laura's going to talk about.
So for those of you who are not familiar with Universal Design for Learning, just a brief background. CAST is a nonprofit education research and development organization. They're the creators of Universal Design for Learning framework and the UDL guidelines that are now used the world over to make learning more inclusive. The project actually started in the mid-1980s. And it was a project that started to focus on how computers could enhance learning for students with disabilities through built environments. And as CAS evolved, it focused more on how the design of the curriculum could inherently meet the needs of different learners. And so that's where this term Universal Design for Learning came in versus just universal design. That is, we can create equitable, inclusive, and accessible learning environments. CAST now has a whole bunch of talented employees, and they have a book that came out, and I think Sean's going to put the book in the chat there if you're interested in reading the whole book that she cited on the last slide. But no need to read the whole book. As a primer for UDL, CAST has this fantastic one-pager PDF that we're also going to put the link to in the chat, that we're going to kind of use as our basis for the presentation today. So it's udlguidelines.cast.org. Some parts of this we're going to kind of race through because they apply less to textbooks, and some of this we're going to spend more time on. as they apply more to textbooks versus the classroom. The guidelines can be used by educators, curriculum developers, researchers, parents, anyone who wants to implement the framework in a learning environment. And the guidelines offer a set of concrete suggestions, and you'll see that if you've gone to the page that there's a very, I'm only showing you the top part of that that PDF, but there's an awful lot of information on there. Basically, there's 3 essential pieces to the guidelines based on the 3 primary brain networks that are shown in the slides. Multiple means of engagement, representation, and action and expression to meet learners where they are. These are referred to by CAST as the why of learning, the what of learning, and the how of learning. You might notice on these that there's brain highlighting. So the green area in engagement is the affective network in the brain. The purple is the recognition network in the brain, and the blue is the strategic network of the brain. So by different activities, you can activate the different parts of the brain, which is going to provide you with a more meaningful experience. So basically the why is, does it have meaning, relevance? This is where you want to engage your learner. The what is, does it make sense? Is there context in the content? And the how is, how are you actually implementing the learning? So hopefully by now you pulled up the fantastic guidelines from the CAST website, and you will see lots and lots of ways to honor these 3 areas on there. So what we're going to do is we're going to go more quickly through the why and the how, but today we're going to focus on the what, since that's the context and content, which is where a lot of our textbooks or ideas are lying. So, so here we go. So we do acknowledge that the why of learning can occur in learning materials, and I'm going to mention a few here briefly. Why? If you can't engage your learner, the information becomes inaccessible, right? Because the relevant information won't get noticed, and so it won't get processed. How can you engage with the content? You can vary your activities like gamifying, doing group work, doing individual work. So you'll see on that handout that there are 3 kind of sections underneath the section that I just showed, that where the brain is. You want to provide options for recruiting interest. These are activities that fall in here, things that you might incorporate into your writing, like keeping things in mind in your sources, such as cultural relevancy, age appropriateness, and contextualize to readers' lives. So there is a little bit of relevancy here in the why. You could also invite self-reflection of content within your materials, tasks that allow for exploration. You can do, like I said, reflection, which is really important to learning. Again, this is in the context of the ways that you engage your learner is where this falls into UDL. So in sustaining options, this is where you get into using prompts or scaffolding to visualize desired outcomes. So we do this in writing with learning objectives and using call outs, right? And if you have an ebook, you could actually link your learning objectives to the section. If you put the learning objectives at the beginning, you could link them to the section of the chapter and navigate straight to that section if that's where the learner wants to go. There's one area under sustaining effort that's called increased mastery oriented feedback. And that relates to a lot of the adaptive learning components that are incorporated in a lot of textbooks as a way to maybe engage with more of the material. In the self-regulation, this is where the learner will manage their frustration in the learning process and use real-life simulations or situations to demonstrate a coping skill, like you didn't give up. Awesome. Look what happened when you didn't give up, right? So this could be incorporated into some textbook materials as well. So So that's the kind of the short of the engagement piece of UDL and how we kind of thought about it applying to textbooks. If we go on to action and expression, or the how of learning, which occurs more in the classroom, not as much in the learning materials. This includes providing options and choices to demonstrate knowledge, right? So how can students express that they actually understand something? So in the physical area, you could provide alternatives for interacting with the material independent, or provide some independent access to the material. So Sean, if you can just give it one more click. Some of the ebooks actually have audio with them, right? So that would be a different physical way to interact with the material, just as an example. In expression, you can give students opportunities to do other things besides writing a paper, right? So, you know, the stereotype is students take a midterm exam and then they turn in a paper maybe, and then they get a final grade, or, you know, that's kind of the traditional way of having a classroom go. But this UDL is saying, hey, you don't have to give a paper all the time. You could have them do something else to demonstrate their knowledge, have them make a video, have them do something else, provide multiple ways, do some other kind of presentation in order to get through an assignment, right? So, and your assignments, you'd want to scaffold them to increase independence in the learner over time, right? So that's the expression. Again, it's something more that has to do with the classroom than maybe something that we could put into a textbook. And then the executive functions, you could do this in a textbook by something like stop and think, or show and explain, right? So there are ways you could incorporate this into textbooks as checklists at the end of the chapter, maybe. Other items here include giving the student the power to gauge their own progress. So maybe check your progress. This is more of an instructor-oriented decision than maybe a textbook-oriented decision, because you'd have to, you know, the instructor would have to advocate for those items. So we're not going to use this as the focus for our discussion, but we wanted to acknowledge that the importance of this from a pedagogical perspective, the why and the how. So now Sean's going to go on to the what.
So yeah, this is really part of our main focus for today, because it really refers to not just the content that we've talked about, for instance, in the past, the importance of creating diverse and inclusive content, but also about how structuring the information we put in our textbook so that it can help all students learn. So customizing display of information, this is something that it happens in print textbooks, but it's also exciting. Many of you have seen in ebooks, students can change the font size, but also offering multiple ways of displaying information, auditory and visual, but also creating different ways of students getting information that we perhaps haven't thought about so much. And so for one, has been creating accessible figures. I know a number of, we had I think it was in April, we had a conversation circle, TA conversation circle, talking about DEI issues. A number of authors talked about that they were working, that their publisher was having them work with a DEI editor, and they were having some great experiences with that. For me, one of the things happening, I'm in the process of working on my 4th edition of my textbook. One of the things that's happening is we're working on creating more accessible figures. This is an example of my textbook is very data driven because it's for upper division undergraduates and early grad students. So it's got a lot of data from the primary literature as we're trying to increase quantitative reasoning skills and graphical reasoning skills for undergraduates. We were very proud of ourselves. We looked at information on visual acuity and contrast, and so we picked the blue and orange as those were supposed to be great colors for all this. But a couple things have been pointed out to us that these are problematic to see. If you'll notice, the 2 bars are right next to each other. There's no space in between them, which can make them a little challenging. It turns out the color contrast between the blue and orange is not exactly what is up to what they call web accessibility contrast colors. So we have a editor who is coming in and using some of the web content accessibility guidelines. They're out there, and I'm going to put that in the checker in the chat. This is you can all use to check basically contrasts between colors as well as between text and backgrounds. What our editor came back was blue, and then change, you'll notice there's a space between the bars. There's tick marks. This is a paired bar graph, tick marks between the pairs. But they came back with a blue and clear bar, or white bar and white background. While this may pass the accessibility test, one of the things we also think about, though, is, and I'm sure you all do, is this also has to be taught in large classrooms and be displayed on big screens. And that it was going to be, might be a little hard just to see the white with the bar. We also took into account, as I'm sure many of you do, instructors, when they transition to a new textbook, you want to make it as easy as possible for your instructors to transition. So for everybody to have to go from thinking about white or blue and orange bars to go to blue and white bars, and they weren't going to change every graph. They were only going to, our editors were only going to change graphs that they thought were problematic. We proposed something slightly different. And we said one of the ways that you can increase acuity, visual acuity, and accessibility is by not only having the space in between, but also by creating a pattern on bars, on with a second bar. And so we asked, could we change the orange to make the contrast better, but could we also add a pattern to it? This allows instructors who are going to continue to use the book have the same basically color pattern that they're used to now for, I don't know, a lot of years. That's all I can remember. It's been many years now since we're about to go into the 4th edition. But it will also hopefully help students in terms of using hatching patterns. And that's one way that can help students and hopefully help instructors.
So I'm just going to pause here for a second and just say that as we were kind of digging into some of this information, for me, a light bulb went off about how much more accessible an ebook is to a student than a paper textbook. And you know, I would guess like 5 or 8 or 10 years ago when ebooks came out, you know, we were all like, oh my gosh, what are ebooks going to do to us? And you know, they were just a plain old PDF at that time. And as we were looking through a lot of this information, I was like, oh, ebooks are actually real accessible. I'm sure some of you out there who have, you know, been using UDL for decades, probably like, okay, what's wrong with you? But it came, you know, I got beat over the head with it as we were looking at some of this. So as we go through some of this, here's one way that ebooks, you know, I already mentioned the audio before when you're talking about the learner being able to physically access. But in this is another way to think about the audio from the perspective of the teacher or the textbook author. A lot of ebooks have this audio feature on their platform. And Sean, if you'll just give it one click. Again, this is an icon that's in my ebook that's just on the left side. Anytime a student wants to, they can just listen to it. There's also there are apps that you can use, and Speechify is one of those apps. If you go to speechify.com, it'll come on and you can listen to it in the voice of a movie star. You can listen to it in more than one different type of voice. If you want to, you can listen to a book. And then there's also the Vital Source is a bookshelf where you can download or move your audio, your ebooks. And Vital Source also has a read aloud function. And this is the icon for that. So ebooks have a lot of features in them that make the books more accessible. And so some of the things we're going to show you now are some of the ways that it can make the books more accessible. So I'm going to turn back over to Sean.
Yeah, and one has to do with, I think many of us have textbooks that are very dense with vocabulary. And so one of the issues has to do with clarifying vocabulary and what they call supporting decoding of text. And Laura's going to talk about mathematical notation and symbols. And what this really means is we know for students that one of the stopping points for students in learning could be an unfamiliar term, an unfamiliar symbol. And they need very consistent and meaningful exposure to these so that they comprehend and use them effectively. And then when they're not fluent in, say, keywords or terms, that increases their cognitive load of decoding and learning. And that can diminish their capacity for information processing and comprehension. So historically, I think a lot of us had glossaries that were, you remember those in the back of the book? You turned to the back of the book. So when you didn't know a word, you had to switch all the way to the back of the book, look for the word, and then go all the way to where you are now. And that's problematic because that is time and effort. And for students is not a very, a transition that doesn't work well. So this is just an example. Many today textbooks have key terms or keywords, definitions. This is a print edition just on the side, for instance, so that students don't have to go very far. So this helps basically create a more equitable playing field for all students to be able to find information. We've noticed that definitions show up in a variety of ways. Oops, sorry, Laura, this one's yours.
Oh, so you can reorganize things in your print text to put the definitions on the margin. If some ebooks will have the definitions just pop up, right? So here's an example, and
I'm sorry, this is another example. Some definitions, when they pop up, will pop up. You'll notice in the previous edition, they pop up next to the text. In this case, there's a pop-up definition in front of the text with a bar, a colored bar.
And then here's an example from one of our colleagues here, Steve Barkin, who writes a sociology textbook, where the definition is actually popping up. There's a space that's made and the definition pops up underneath of the key term. So different ways of doing it. Now, this brought me to this point, and I didn't even know if anybody did anything like this, but I was thinking this could be a way with symbols to be able to help a student in an ebook. So if you were to hover over, say, the P, pressure would pop up, or you hovered over the V, volume might show up. You hover over the N, number of moles. This is the ideal gas law. I guess not everybody knew that, but R would be a gas constant. You know, if you hover over the symbols, could you get it to just pop up what the symbol refers to or references? And I didn't know if anybody's books did that or not. If yours does, and you have an ebook, just put something in the chat there, because I thought that might be something that I don't know if publishers have thought about that might be really helpful for learners. So that's the language and the symbols. The next thing that we're going to mention under language and symbols, if you're still looking at that chart, this is another area, illustrate through multiple media. You know, sometimes the print version might work better. And so I show this. This is my textbook, and oftentimes we'll put a figure or a picture in the margin right next to the text. That, you know, this says, did you know that every snowflake is unique, yet every snowflake has 6 sides, right? And so there's the snowflake right next to the text. In the ebook, it translated to this. So if you were a student and you were scrolling from the top down, you wouldn't actually get to the snowflake until much later as you were reading. And so the relevance of the snowflake is kind of lost in the e-text. in this example, right? So, I mean, we're just bringing some of this stuff up because we're thinking, these are things that we might want to think about as we're designing and or reviewing our own materials as we go along. So that's one of my examples, and Sean is going to show you another example.
Yeah, the other one that we know of for students is obviously our textbooks are dominated by a lot of information. Text can be challenging to understand, sometimes complicated concepts. Alternatives like illustrations, simulations, images, or interactive graphics, many of you may have this, can often make concepts more easily accessible for students. So in animal behavior, this is like one of the keystones of animal behavior. There was a famous researcher who asked these 4 questions about animal behavior, and it basically has to do with what we call proximate and ultimate, sort of the mechanistic ways animal behavior has, like physiological ways, and then the evolutionary ways we can look at questions. And I can't tell you, instructors go like, this is something everybody needs to know, and students really, really struggle with this. So my co-author and I also struggled. And so one of the things we tried to do was create a graphic. So rather than just have students look at these questions that we've all looked at for a million years, it feels like, and not understand them, we created a graphic where we have the questions still. In this case, we've got an answer with them, and then we've got a short little graphic that we drew with icons, and then had an artist, our publishing company had an artist create, but allows students basically then to have a different representation of a concept. And for many of our learners, that's an important thing, to not just have a text representation, but to also have a graphical or a figure representation for some really tough concepts. And this can also really help for students who might struggle thinking about these different perspectives. This is something that's gotten a lot of good feedback from our students as well as from authors. And the last category we want to talk about is this comprehension, because we really want to create these learners who are resourceful and knowledgeable. And this refers to a couple of things: how to activate or supply background knowledge, how to highlight patterns, big ideas, and relationships. That's one that students are always very concerned about. Those of you who are in the classroom know that's a big one for having students put together those big patterns. Guide information processing and visualization, and then being able to maximize the information transfer and generalization. And so we're going to talk about some ways that that can happen.
So here's another way that I think ebooks make the learning more accessible. So spiraling, which is referring back to things earlier in the book that you might have mentioned earlier, is a lot easier in an ebook, because you can just simply put a link to the previous section that you want to refer to. And this takes the student right back to that section in case they want to review it. And then they can just click out of it and come back to this part of, the text they were reading. So this is, activating their prior knowledge becomes easier with an ebook. And then the other piece of comprehension that I wanted to mention here was highlighting patterns and big ideas from relationships. And here's an example of a flow chart. Again, this you could put in an ebook or in the print text that would just highlight relationships and guide the learner to better understanding the concept through a visual kind of flow chart. This is an example of a biology textbook by Scott Freeman, and he's very well written in the literature for understanding learning in STEM education. And he has a intro biology text. And at the beginning of every chapter, he's got this structure. Instead of having the learning outcomes just listed, he's actually got the learning outcomes related to each other. So this is chapter 1. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the different sections. And you can actually see how the sections of the chapter are related to each other. Now that you all have this UDL lens on, I will tell you that in the ebook for this book, you cannot click on the individual learning outcomes and go to the section, which would be another step up for this book, right? As if you could click on 1.1 and it would take you to section 1.1, or you could click on 1.3 and it would take, but the ebook for this doesn't actually do that yet. It just shows you this structure at the beginning of the chapter. So I was, like, oh man, there's an opportunity that's missed here. But once again, I know the publishers, they're working on these things, but we could be advocates for these things in our own textbooks if we knew about them, right?
Yeah, and one way is these really nice visualizations to guide a student to understanding what's coming up in a textbook, how it relates to each other. Another way is sort of a more fine scale, is having students use things like concept maps. So there's flow charts which sort of help you understand patterns and where things are going. Concept maps are slightly different. These are a graphical tool for organizing and representing knowledge and understanding the relationships between knowledge, which for many students, as I'm sure you all know, I'm not telling anybody who's taught anything new, is that often that's a big problem for students, is understanding the relationships between concepts and putting them all together. This is basically a concept map. It is from one of my favorite books, Ambrose and Ambrose, A Handbook of Biological Investigation, that I used to have every freshman biology student use. And then I would hand to every grad student that I had and say, this is what you need to get ready for your comprehensive exams, my friend, because you're going to get asked about statistics. And so I have a page for you that's going to make your life better when it comes time preparing for your comprehensive exams. And what this beautiful graph does is it talks about basically a whole bunch of statistics and puts them together. So if you have a question about correlations, you go down the left side. If you have a question about differences between distributions, means, or variances, you go down the right side. If you have a difference between means, between two samples, you get to decide between non-parametric and metric. If you have more than two samples, you go here. I can't tell you, I won't say that I have single-handedly saved grad students' comprehensive exams by any means by giving them this, but I do think for a lot of students, this has been incredibly helpful. Concept maps are just incredibly helpful. We do also know from the literature that having students create their own concept maps is incredibly powerful. Someone who used to teach the immune system and immunology to freshman biology, that would be, I would think we would have talked about it in my most brilliant of manner, that we all had everything down. We'd done a couple of exercises. It was just, concrete, and still pretty sure I had students looking at me like deer in the headlights, pretty dazed. Yeah, me too. I wish I'd have been there when I was doing mine. But one of the things I started doing was I had all my, however many hundreds of students it was, create basically a concept map to the immune system. And it was really challenging, but in the end, they loved it because they had to understand how all those different cells, what they did, how they related to each other. So that's the kind of thing we can also build in to, for instance, many of us, if we have some sort of ebook, there's things we can, pull and push around in a figure to allow students to do these kinds of things. But having that kind of information and helping students put these together, these big patterns, either us doing it or having activities to help them do it, can just be really important for students. So yeah, this will probably be on my bedside table until, I don't know, the end. Another one that I find for students and for many of you, because I do have students read a lot of the primary literature, having students learn how to synthesize and summarize information is just a real challenge for both upper undergrads as well as beginning grad students. So helping them learn how to do that. My co-author and I'll have to give up Tom Ballone, good guy, might have be also. Let me just say, if you're gonna have a co-author, I just suggest make sure it's your husband. It's a great working relationship, although he always knows where you are. So there's no excuses if you don't get something done. I'll just say that. Sorry, Tom. But anyhow, my co-author and I came up with what we call a scientific process box, which is basically a way to help students learn that you can synthesize and summarize a scientific research paper into a very few set of sentences. We have these throughout our textbook and then have exercises where students do them on their own from other primary resources. And it's just been a great resource for students to start to learn how to do that important synthesizing and summarizing of information that is often a real challenge for students.
All right, so we're wondering if you thought of any good ideas while you were listening to us and or writing things down. And so we're going to go back to the questions that you answered at the beginning to see if we put you to sleep, which would be if your number went down to number 1. And then, you know, where do you now locate your skill set in terms of textbook design, and how comfortable are you in talking with your publisher about your textbook design now? So you just, you know, jot that down. And at this point, Sean, I think we're going to open it up for questions too, or comments.
Yeah, I'm going to stop the share so we can all see folks. And please feel free to raise your hand, put something in chat, or just unmute yourself. We're excited to hear about your ideas.
We have a lot of experts in the room, sounded like.
So Marielle has a question in the chat. I don't know if you can see it. Do you have maps in your textbooks? And if so, have you found a good solution for problems with color/contrast between regions and or with overlays? In biology, for example, maps of different ecoregions seem very difficult to render in a way that is accessible because there's a limited number of contrast-friendly colors. And using patterns in addition to colors makes the map cluttered and harder to interpret.
Yeah, Marielle, I will say that is hard. I only have a few maps I just speak from my own personal experience and mine, but we have some bar graphs that have 4 and 5 clustered bar graphs. And I will say we are still ongoing discussion of how to keep adding colors. A lot of it has to do with different hatching patterns, so it's been different colors and a combination of colors and hatching patterns, but that is a really tough one. I would say the web accessibility, that website is really helpful because you can go in and put your 2 colors in and sort of see if they pass. So the other thing is 2 colors next to each other have to pass, but 2 colors, like, you know, if it's this if it's one ecoregion and then separated by a different ecoregion and another one 3 ones away, and though they still need to be different. But maybe you can then, you know, have solids and then have ones with different kinds of hatching. So we're finding it's a lot of colors and hatchings, but in some ways it looks a little more cluttered. So I don't have other people have hopefully some great ideas. That's a great question. It is a challenge.
Yeah, so as you were talking, I was thinking that, you know, if you need that many contrasts and to colors and hatching, maybe you need to rethink the figure. Maybe you have too much information on there. I don't know, because I don't know the context that you're referring to, but you know, instead of like 50 states of the United States, maybe you just need to focus on a particular region, and then you would have less contrasting patterns, right? Or something like that. So maybe it's just revising the figure itself to have less areas of contrast. That's what I was thinking.
So Cheryl has a question that coincidentally has been my lifelong quest. And that is, do you have any advice on writing effective alt text for images? And what I think of, what triggers me when I read that is, I write in anatomy and physiology, but many, uh, many disciplines have this issue. And that is, what if you have an image that has a ton of information in it? And then you have to write alt text, which is, like a phrase or two. How do you do that? So what kind of advice in general do you have for writing alt text?
Yeah, I am dealing with that a lot because I have a lot of animal behavior videos. So I have to do it not only for images, but I also have to do it for videos. And part of my issue is some of the videos come with activities. So I actually need students to watch the video and then answer questions, which we're still struggling with. Yeah, getting it to the one, I confess, every time I read anything else, I go look at other people's alt text. And I have learned a lot from reading other people's alt text to sort of see for myself what I thought really worked. And then I was sort of like, yeah, that didn't help me at all. The other thing I'll say is if you have a chance and you watch movies and things, turn on your alt text on your movies or your TV, because you can listen. And that I also have just found it's helpful to me just to start getting my head into the kinds of things that, people will say and that will help, obviously is going to help supposedly a movie goer. So, and then having somebody else look at it. So, write it, have somebody else look at it and then tell you without looking at the figure, do you think this is what that figure would be about? Kevin, what do you do?
I've given up. No, I think that's really good advice. I do look around, but I've not made a um, sort of a intentional activity of it. So I'm going to take that to heart and do more of that and look and see what other people are doing. So it kind of gets in my head, and I can kind of learn those like patterns and approaches and so on. But I've looked through a lot of. I've spent a lot of time looking at instructions for how to do it, and that helps a lot because it gives you some basic principles to work with. And that is, keep it simple, keep it short, and really get to what's essential in that thing. Any of you who know me know that when I tell a story, and I love to tell stories, I give too much detail and too much information. I don't stick to the important parts of the story, like right now. And so that has been very helpful to just get rid of the extraneous information that I can think of to describe that image. Um, and really just stick to, what does that student need to see here? What is the essential thing that the student needs to see?
Thank you. That sounds like good advice. So
So,
Deanna has a
oh, go ahead.
question here. Do you have any inside experience using QR codes with links to videos and textbooks? I'm a music scholar and teacher, and in our discipline, videos are important learning tools. So I will just tell you that the ebook that I have has the videos embedded right within as the student's scrolling along, boom, a video pops up. So it's not even just a QR code, which then the student would have to put their phone there to watch the video. The video's right on the embedded within. Is that the kind of thing you were referring to? Or are you talking about like in a physical textbook? I guess you would put the QR code maybe in the margin.
You're muted.
Okay. She gave us a thumbs up, so I guess that means we got it.
Right, I can understand that will work in ebooks. I was thinking mainly like in a paper if I have QR codes.
Yeah, and that's a great question. I'm actually, I think it was a 6-month struggle with my publisher. I love Oxford. You're lovely people. But my struggle was many of the videos I use come from YouTube, because even things from Nature, BBC, well-known documentaries, they all house them on YouTube. And is one of the things YouTube, it has closed captioning, but it doesn't do things like alt text. So it's technically not accessible as a source. So we've come to an agreement that it can no longer be embedded into the text, but it can be at the end of a chapter. But yeah, QR codes are a great way for students to do that. The key I will say is the code can't be too small. If it's too small, it's hard for the camera to read it. So that's anybody else having any issues with QR codes? And Robert, the shift to digital from print was clumsy and a challenge with publishers, especially formatting pages, compositing, converting an effective print layout. Publishers were difficult to work with, especially as the author increases their intrusion into the entire design process. Each platform change by a publisher almost started the layout challenge from scratch. I will say I totally feel your pain. I love my publisher, but let's just say design is not their forte. I'm just going to leave it at that.
Yeah, I think the original shift was a little bit bumbling. I agree with Robert. Publishers were just trying to figure out what works. And there might have been a few missteps there, but I think now we're streamlining things a little bit more. So hopefully things will get a little more streamlined as we go forward.
A practical consideration that we've run into in our titles that a lot of people I don't think know about. We didn't know about it until it just happened to come up in a conversation where we were kind of going back and forth about the design. And that is, they have different, some of these publishers, or at least our does, I work with Elsevier, and they have different sort of different ways that they can do an ebook. So, and we don't know that. We're not part of that decision making. We're not part of that process. We're not told about it until, we kind of pushed back on something and got that as an answers. Well, we could have, put it into this other format or this other format. In other words, they're all like EPUB or whatever the basic format is, but there's different like designs and levels of detail and things like that that they can incorporate. And that's all siloed off into somebody you don't work with as an author. And so it might be a question to ask if those kind of issues start coming up.
Yeah, that's a great point, Kevin. I don't think the first time our ebook came out, we're like, I don't even know where to find it and what it is. And the first ones were just PDFs. Oxford's gotten a little more sophisticated. It's certainly not like the big publishing houses like, Pearson and things. But I confess we've done a lot of pushback, sort of saying, okay, you need to show us things. We need to see what's going on. But it's still a big learning curve. Deanne, what type of copyright considerations are there when using ebooks, and how do you navigate those? Are you thinking of that
librarian?
Yeah. Are you thinking of things like YouTube, Deanne?
Do you want to unmute, Deanne?
If you're referring to me, I actually did not ask that question. So I don't know.
No, Deanne Taylor.
Sure.
Sorry.
Yes, that's what I was just wondering, what types, if any, copyright decision-making must take place when considering an ebook?
Yeah, I know for us, obviously the photos have the same copyright that we use, and the images have the same copyrights as do the print. And the videos, if they're on YouTube, we just have to give them accreditation, I think is the deal. The biggest issue we've had is just that YouTube is not considered fully accessible. And so it is not a preferred medium by our publisher or most publishers. And so, but that's where everybody puts their stuff.
Thank you.
So the next question, should publishers be aware of the variety of representations a digital textbook writer might use? I would say yes. Or is it important for authors to research their options? I would say yes. Right. I mean, if I want to make the best textbook accessible to the biggest audience, I should be aware of those things. I agree that the publisher should also be aware of those things, but oftentimes they're not. And so, so it's up to us to be able to bring those things to them and provide the evidence for why we should maybe be doing it this way, which is part of why we're all here, right? To share ideas and things that are working. Let's see.
Oh, Paul, that's good to know about Ludenzo. I'll check those out. Ludenzo does things with QR codes. That's really helpful. And Cheryl points up the point that, yeah, link rot can be a concern. And yeah, so that's one of the things that we always have to, that's an important thing that we have to think about too. Jana, follow-up question is, does anyone have experience with creating educational whiteboard videos? Yeah, the commercial sites are very expensive, whiteboard sites that are more friendly to budget of educators. I would say check with your local teaching center. Those tend to be the folks on your campus that have access to those and might be able to help you. There are some videos out there on sort of how to do it on your own, but it's a little complicated.
Oh, Camtasia.
Oh, yeah.
That's a good
Yep.
idea. Yeah. Thanks, Ruth.
And I apologize if I don't say it correctly. Cheval, yeah, broken links. In a perfect world, I would like hire an undergrad to check them every month, all the broken links, but I don't. I think because the ones I use come from things that are, like science and nature, and a lot of them are from journals. They aren't ones that tend to go dead, but they do occasionally. But yeah, that's one I try to check out from time to time. And also, since my husband's still teaching the course, he checks out more often than I do. QR codes can access your own animation library that go with figures. Oh, cool. That's very cool.
Yeah, it looks like we're at about time. So I want to thank you, Laura and Sean. This was an amazing session. I really got a lot out of it. And I want to thank all of you for participating in this session.